We've seen the command of forgiveness, we've seen the power of forgiveness. I want to finish by just talking about the process of forgiveness. How do we really forgive? You see, forgiveness is not just a matter of words. It's something that happens in our hearts and in our minds. It's possible to say, I forgive you, and yet still live in a state of unforgiveness. It's even possible to convince other people that you are forgiven, yet in your heart, you still hold on. As we said, Joseph is a great example of forgiveness. I don't know what I would do to my brother if he sold me into slavery. And at times it's probably felt like it as well. Joseph's brother sold him into slavery. Eventually we know the story, I'm sure, how Joseph becomes prime minister, and years later his brothers meet up with him. Let me read you the account of that meeting in Genesis chapter 45. 4 to 10, Genesis 45. This is Joseph now talking to his brothers. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer, and he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery. But don't be upset, and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and tell him this is what your son Joseph says. God has made me master over all the land of Egypt, so come down immediately. You can live in the region of Goshen, where you can be near me with all your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds and everything you own. And then just on to verse 14. Weeping with joy, he embraced Benjamin, and Benjamin did the same. Then Joseph kissed each of his brothers and wept over them, and after they began talking freely with him. Excuse me. Great story of how Joseph forgives. But we actually see there 5 stages of the process of forgiveness that we can perhaps learn to put into action as we forgive others. And the first stage that Joseph had in forgiving his brothers was simply that he recognised the hurt that he'd been caused. Joseph quite clearly remembers that his brothers sold him into slavery. You sold me into slavery. That is what Joseph said to his brothers. You know, if we're going to truly forgive someone, we have to start by admitting and recognising that we've been hurt. If we fail to recognise the hurt, then we have nothing to forgive. We have nothing to forgive. We have to recognise, and it's painful, but we have to do it. Why? Perhaps for 3 reasons. Firstly, we have to recognise the hurt, because if we just sweep it under the carpet, as so many people do, you know what happens? One day the carpet gets lifted up, and there's a complete mess. A complete mess. Friends, if we just sweep things under the carpet in our lives, all the hurt, all the pain, one day we will explode. Okay, we might explode with anger, with depression, with lots of other things. We cannot afford to run the risk of just sweeping things under the carpet all the time. We have to recognise and admit that we've been hurt. The second reason why it's good to admit what has hurt us is simply because when we actually sit down and work out what all the problem is about, we wonder what all the problem is about. You know, lots of married couples will argue over a sock that's been left on the kitchen floor or the bedroom floor. Don't know if you've ever done that, okay? And the whole thing just escalates, doesn't it? And when you sit down and you remember what has actually caused the hurt here, you think, it's a smelly old sock. What is all the fuss about? I want to say to you, a sock is not worth a night on the sofa, man. Okay? The sock is not worth spending the night on the sofa for. We have to sometimes just sit down, work out what has caused the problem, and sometimes that simple action can just bring forgiveness where it needs to be. The other reason why it's good to recognise the hurt is sometimes when we think about it, we actually find that we are the ones who should be giving the forgiveness rather than demanding it. When we actually work out what has caused the problem. Now that wasn't the case with Joseph, but he had to recognise, and we need to recognise, what has hurt us, where the pain is, before we can even begin the journey of being forgiving and forgiving each other. So we have to recognise the hurt. The second thing that Joseph had to do was resolve the anger. You know, he says to his brothers, don't be angry with yourselves. And he could only say that because he wasn't angry with them. That's amazing, isn't it? After all they'd done to Joseph, Joseph still wasn't angry. Forgiveness can never really be from the heart if anger is still in our lives. We have to resolve the anger. Now, of course, there are times when we have to go through the anger and come out the other side. We have to experience that anger and come through that. And sometimes that anger is justified for a time. You know, I think my mum was justified to say I would knock their blocks off, okay, to those who'd broken into her house. It's right to be angry sometimes when people sin against us. But again, we have to come and we have to resolve that at some point. And we have to let go of the anger. We have to let go of that bitterness in order that forgiveness might flow. I want to encourage you. If you're angry over something that has happened, and it may be many, many years ago, but if you're angry over something that somebody has done to you, then today is the day to let that anger go. The anger must be resolved if forgiveness, powerful forgiveness, flows. We forgive by recognising the hurt, by resolving the anger.